I never imagined that the eve of my wedding would end this way. The calendar marked a Thursday in April in Mexico City, and the warm spring air streamed through my window as I organized the final details of what should be the happiest day of my life. I was 2 days away from marrying Alejandro, the love of my life, in a beautiful ceremony at the San Juan Bautista Parish in Coyoacán. Alejandro and I met 4 years ago in a cafe in the historic center. He was sitting at the next table, focused on his laptop while drinking a pot of coffee. I had entered to take shelter from a sudden rain, typical of the season. When the waiter accidentally spilled my hibiscus water on his computer, I thought it would be the end of the world. Instead of getting angry, Alejandro just smiled and said that the universe has strange ways of bringing people together. From that day on, our story was like a whirlwind. We discovered that we shared a love for the music of Café Tacva, Sundays in Chapultepec and the Suadero tacos on the corner. Alejandro was an architect in a prestigious office of the Countess, and I worked as a teacher in a primary school in Rome. Our worlds were different but complementary, like puzzle pieces that fit together perfectly. However, not everything was rosy. His family, especially his mother, Dona Leticia, never fully accepted me. She came from a wealthy family in Las Lomas, and I was just a public school teacher living in a small apartment on Narvarte. Every time we gathered for Sunday dinner at his house, I could feel his disapproving gaze, as if every bite I took was an affront to his refined table. Dona Leticia was one of those ladies who belonged to all the important social clubs in the city, organized charity events at the Industrials Club and never repeated a designer dress. To her, I was like a stain on her family's impeccable social record. My son could be with someone on his level, I heard her say once during one of her parties, when she thought I couldn't hear her. But Alejandro always defended me. Love does not understand social classes, mother, he told her firmly every time she tried to introduce him to one of her friend's daughters. Their unconditional support made me feel that we could overcome any obstacle. Even when his mother refused to participate in the wedding preparations, Alejandro remained firm in his decision to marry me. That night, as I was going over the final details of the dress my mother had helped pay for with her savings, I received a message that would change everything. The sound of the WhatsApp notification echoed in my small living room. "I need to see you." "It's important," said Dona Leticia's message. My heart skipped a beat. In 4 years, he had never written to me directly. I hesitated to answer. The clock showed 8:30 at night, and the streets of the city were already quieter. My best friend, Lucia, had warned me 1,000 times about my future mother-in-law's attitude. "Be careful with that lady," he always told me, "the most dangerous snakes are the ones that hide in mansions in Polanco." But something inside me wanted to believe that, perhaps, I had finally had a change of heart. Maybe he finally wanted to make peace before the wedding. After all, she was going to be the grandmother of her future grandchildren. I replied that I would go, naively thinking that we could resolve our differences. The Uber dropped me off in front of his imposing house in Las Lomas. The security guard recognized me and let me pass without problems. As I walked through the perfectly manicured garden towards the main entrance, I noticed something felt different. The lights in the house were dimmer than normal, and the usual movement of the servants was absent. Dona Leticia welcomed me with a smile that I had never seen before. It was a tight smile, like someone who is about to do something they might regret. She led me into the main living room, where I had so often felt out of place among her designer furniture and original works of art. "Would you like some tea?" he asked with unusual kindness. "I just received a wonderful chai tea from India." I nodded, more out of courtesy than desire. As she went to the kitchen, I looked at the family photos on the walls. Alejandro as a child, his brother Javier at his graduation, the whole family on their vacations in Europe. I would soon be part of those photos, although I doubted that Dona Leticia would want to hang our wedding photos along with her precious family memories. He returned with 2 cups of steaming tea. He offered me one and sat down in front of me. You know, he began, I've always wanted the best for my son. I took a sip of the tea, which tasted strangely sweet. And sometimes, as a mother, we must make difficult decisions for the sake of our children. His voice began to sound distant, as if he were speaking from the end of a long tunnel. The room began to spin, and the photos on the walls became blurs. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't respond. The cup slipped from my hands and crashed onto the Italian marble floor. The last thing I remember clearly was Donna Letitia's voice, now cold and determined, I'm sorry, dear, but I can't allow you to ruin my son's future. Then everything went black. When I partially regained consciousness, I was in total darkness. The air was heavy and humid, and my body felt like it weighed a ton. I tried to move, but I was in a tight space and my limbs were barely responding. The smell of gasoline and movement made me realize I was in the trunk of a car. Through the haze of my consciousness, I heard Donna Letitia's voice, clear and authoritative, take her to the Sonoran Desert, anywhere far from my dear son. Make sure he can't come back. Fear completely paralyzed me, and before I could scream, darkness enveloped me again. The car was moving fast on the highway, probably the Mexico-Querétaro highway, judging by the curves and the time we had been traveling. The effects of the drugged tea were beginning to wear off, but my mind was still foggy, as if I were trying to wake up from a particularly vivid nightmare. The roar of the engine and the sound of the tires on the asphalt mixed with my confused thoughts. I had no idea who was driving or what exactly Donna Letitia's plan was. Fear washed over me like a bone-deep cold, but I forced myself to think clearly. My cell phone was missing, it had probably been left at her house. The only belongings I had with me were the clothes I was wearing, jeans, a pink blouse that my mother had given me, and some sneakers that, ironically, I had bought for the honeymoon trip. I tried to orient myself by the sounds and movements of the vehicle. Every time we hit a bump or a pothole, my body shook against the floor of the trunk. The space was so tight that he could barely move his legs, and the air grew heavier with each passing minute. The smell of gasoline made me nauseous, mixing with the residual sweet taste of tea in my mouth. My mind wandered between memories and desperate thoughts. How did I not see the signs? Donna Letitia's looks during family meals, her seemingly innocent comments about my job as a teacher, the way she always mentioned her friends' daughters when Alejandro was present. Look, son, do you remember Paulina? She just finished her master's degree at the Sorbonne, he said with that honeyed tone that now gave me chills when I remembered it. I hit the inside of the trunk with all my might, first with my hands and then with my feet. I screamed until my throat burned, but the noise of the engine drowned out my calls for help. Help! Please help! The sound of my own screams bounced around the enclosed space, reminding me how alone I was in this situation. Tears began to run down my cheeks as I thought about Alejandro. Would you be worried about me? Had he noticed my absence? We had agreed not to see each other until the wedding, following the tradition that his mother cared so much about. How ironic that agreement was now. My last message had been to say goodnight and remind him that I loved him. How many hours had passed since then? After what seemed like an eternity of punching and screaming, I fell silent, trying to control my heavy breathing. Panic wouldn't help me get out of this situation. I needed to think, stay calm, and find a way to escape. My father's words resonated in my mind, Majita, in difficult moments, breathe deeply and think with a cool head. I tried to remember everything that had happened before I lost consciousness. Donna Letitia's call, her forced smile, the tea with a strange taste. Why did you decide to do something so extreme? It was one thing not to accept me as a daughter-in-law, but this was a crime. Kidnapping is a serious crime in Mexico, even for someone with your connections and money. The hours passed, and the car continued its relentless march. From the change in temperature and sounds, I could guess that we were moving away from the city. The air was becoming drier and hotter, and the urban noises had given way to the silence of the countryside. From time to time, he heard the passing of other vehicles, probably cargo trucks on the federal highway. My mind wandered between different scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. Would they leave me abandoned in the middle of the desert? Would they hand me over to someone else? Stories of kidnappings and disappearances in Mexico were all too common, and now I was the protagonist of one of them. The irony of the situation did not escape me. I, who had always been so cautious, who never went out alone at night, who had all the emergency numbers saved on my cell phone, had fallen into the most basic trap of trusting the mother. From my fiancé. Time lost meaning in the darkness of the trunk. I could only measure its pace by changes in temperature and sounds outside. The heat was becoming more intense, and the air drier, unmistakable signs that we were heading towards the north of the country. The Sonoran Desert, Dona Leticia had said. Thousands of kilometers of sand and cacti where a person could disappear without a trace. My thoughts turned to my family. My mother would be preparing the last details of the wedding dress that she had saved for months. My father would probably be practicing his speech for the reception, the one he'd been writing and rewriting for weeks. My younger sister, Anna, who had requested special permission from the university to help with the preparations. How long would it be before they realized something was wrong? The car took a sharp curve, and I felt like we were veering off the main road. The asphalt gave way to a more irregular road, probably dirt. The stones and potholes shook the vehicle violently, and my body hit the walls of the trunk. The heat had become almost unbearable, and the air was so thin that each breath required a conscious effort. I tried to stay calm, remembering the happy moments with Alejandro. Our first kiss in Parque Mexico, under the rain of jacarandas. Sunday afternoons in Coyoacán, eating elotes and esquites while we walked through the craft market. The plans we had made for the future, a small but cozy house, perhaps in Condesa or Roma, 2 children, a dog. All of that seemed so far away now, as unreal as a mirage in the desert to which they were taking me. The driver, whoever he was, maintained a stony silence. He hadn't heard a word, not a cough, not even the sound of the radio. Just the engine, the wheels, and the desert wind that was beginning to whistle around the vehicle. Who would it be? Any trusted employee of Dona Leticia? A hired criminal? The possibilities terrified me. After what seemed like days, but was probably only 3 or 4 hours, the car began to slow down. My heart raced. Had we reached our final destination? The vehicle came to a complete stop, and the engine shut off. The silence that followed was deafening. I could only hear my own heavy breathing and the tinkling of the engine cooling. The driver's door opened with a metallic screech. Steps on gravel. They were approaching the trunk. I held my breath, preparing for the worst. What was waiting for me on the other side? A hitman? A trafficker? My body was shaking uncontrollably, but I forced myself to keep my mind clear. If he was going to have a chance to escape, it would be now. Then, a voice broke the silence. A voice he knew well, a voice he had heard for 4 years at family gatherings, at Christmas parties, at birthdays. Don't be afraid. Everything will be fine. The world stopped for a moment. That voice, it couldn't be. My mind refused to accept what my ears were hearing. The click of the trunk opening sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the desert, and moonlight began to filter through the crack. I recognized the voice immediately, and my body froze as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over me. It couldn't be him. What was he doing here? The trunk lid opened slowly, and the silver light of the moon illuminated his face as if he were an apparition. Javier, Alejandro's older brother, looked down at me with an expression that I couldn't decipher. The desert air hit my face, cool and sharp, so different from the stale air in the trunk. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the vastness of the Sonoran Desert. The saguaro cacti cast ghostly shadows in the moonlight, and in the distance, the mountains stood against the starry sky like sleeping giants. You? I murmured, not being able to believe it. My voice sounded hoarse after all the screaming. Javier had always been a mystery to me. Unlike Alejandro, who was warm and expressive, Javier was reserved, almost hermetic. At family gatherings, he stood on the sidelines, observing everything with his dark, piercing eyes. He was never overtly hostile to me, but he was never particularly friendly either. He was like a shadow on the periphery of my relationship with Alejandro. He helped me out of the trunk with careful movements, as if he was afraid I was going to break. My legs, numb after so many hours in that uncomfortable position, could barely support me. The world spun for a moment, and I had to lean on the car to keep from falling. "You need water," Javier said, heading to the driver's door. He took out a bottle of water and offered it to me. "Drink slowly." I looked at the bottle suspiciously. The last time he had accepted a drink from a member of this family, it had ended up in the trunk of a car. "It's sealed," he added, as if reading my thoughts. He broke the seal and took a drink himself before offering it to me again. The cool water was like a miracle for my parched throat. I drank greedily, as I observed our surroundings. We were on a dirt road that disappeared into the darkness. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. The car, a black Toyota Land Cruiser, was the only sign of civilization for miles around. "Because?" I finally asked, when I could find my voice. "Why are you doing this? How could you help your mother with something like that?" Javier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that painfully reminded me of Alejandro. The brothers had the same thick black hair, the same defined profile, but that was where the similarities ended. Where Alejandro was all smiles and warmth, Javier was sharp angles and long silences. "I'm not helping my mother," he finally said, leaning on the hood of the car. "At least, not in the way you think." The confusion must have shown on my face, because he continued, "My mother called me tonight. He told me I had done something extreme. That he needed my help to protect the family." He let out a bitter laugh. He always uses that phrase when he's about to do something terrible. The desert wind stirred his black shirt, and the moonlight drew shadows on his face that made him look older, more tired. For the first time, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the worry lines on his forehead. "When I got home and saw you unconscious," he stopped, as if the words cost him a physical effort. "I couldn't let the men I had hired take you. You know what my mother is like when she gets an idea in her head. He is capable of anything." A shiver ran down my spine as I thought about what could have happened to me if Javier hadn't intervened. The newspapers were full of stories of people disappearing without a trace in the desert. "I told him I'd take care of it," he continued. That he knew someone who could take care of the problem. He made air quotes with his fingers. He believed me, of course. I have always been the responsible son, the one who fixes things, the one who cleans up messes. I sat on a nearby rock, trying to process everything I was hearing. The night was clear and cold, typical of the desert, and the stars shone with an intensity that is never seen in the city. Under other circumstances, it could have been beautiful. "And Alejandro?" I asked, fearing the answer. "Does he know anything about this?" Javier shook his head. "Alejandro doesn't know anything. And it's better this way, for now." He approached me with slow steps, as if approaching a frightened animal. His eyes, so like his brother's and yet so different, reflected something she hadn't seen in him before: worry, maybe even guilt. "There's something you need to know," he said in a deep voice. "Something about Alejandro." The air seemed to suddenly become colder. The coyotes howled again in the distance, a plaintive sound that seemed to portend bad news. "My mother isn't doing this just because you're a schoolteacher," he continued. It's not just about money or social status. There is something else, something that Alejandro has been hiding from you. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. The last 4 years with Alejandro passed through my mind like a movie, the laughter, the kisses, the plans for the future. What could be so serious as to justify all this? My brother. Javier stopped, as if the words weighed him down. Alejandro is not who he says he is. Time seemed to stop. The desert wind carried away the rest of his words, but I was no longer listening. My world, which had already been shaken by the kidnapping, threatened to collapse completely. I remembered all the little inconsistencies I had noticed over the years, the calls Alejandro took privately, the work meetings that stretched into the early hours, the business trips that came up suddenly. He had always found reasonable explanations for everything, or maybe he had chosen not to see the signs. What are you talking about? I managed to ask, although my voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Javier sat next to me on the rock. For a moment, only the silence of the desert and the rapid beat of my heart could be heard. The stars continued to shine indifferent to my pain, my confusion, my fear. My mother is a terrible woman, he finally said. She's manipulative, controlling, and capable of doing things like this. He made a gesture that took in the car, the desert, the situation in general. But this time, for once in his life, he's trying to prevent something worse. He stood up and walked a few steps, his silhouette silhouetted against the starry sky. When he turned to look at me, his face was tense, like he was about to deliver bad news in an emergency room. What I'm about to tell you. He ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture he now recognized as a sign of nervousness. It will change everything you think you know about my brother. The desert air grew colder, or maybe it was fear settling in my chest like a block of ice. The cacti cast longer and longer shadows, and the moon seemed to observe us with cruel indifference. Do you remember when Alejandro was in Monterrey for work last year? Javier asked. I nodded. It had been a 3-month trip to oversee an important project. I had missed him terribly, but the late-night video calls and his constant messages had made the distance more bearable. I wasn't in Monterrey, Javier said in a flat voice. He was in Guadalajara, with his other family. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The world began to spin, and I had to hold on to the rock to keep from falling. Thousands of questions arose in my mind, but none managed to reach my lips. He has a wife, Javier continued, each word falling like a stone into a bottomless pit. And 2 small children. A completely different life from the one you know. The silence that followed was deafening. The crickets stopped singing, the coyotes fell silent, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. All that remained was the sound of my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. I wobbled as I tried to stand up, but Javier held me steady. His hands were different from Alexander's, rougher, stronger, marked by years of construction work. It was strange to think about those details at a time like this, but I guess my mind was trying to cling to anything other than the terrible truth I had just heard. You need to sit down, Javier said, guiding me back to the rock. There is more you need to know. The desert sky stretched above us like a black blanket dotted with stars. The Milky Way was visible as a bright streak across the sky, something that could never be seen in the city. The beauty of the moment contrasted cruelly with the pain he felt in his chest. It can't be true, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I know him. We have been together 4 years. I would have realized. Javier let out a heavy sigh. His eyes reflected something strange. It was not hatred, nor coldness, but a mixture of guilt and compassion that was difficult for me to process. Listen to me, he said, sitting down across from me on a smaller rock. My mother doesn't want you to marry Alejandro because she knows his story, his lies. And although his methods are, he paused, searching for the right word, extreme, this time he's trying to prevent more people from getting hurt. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, melancholy sound that seemed to resonate with my own pain. The desert wind had increased, bringing with it the scent of dry earth and desert plants. As I finally managed to ask, how can he have another family? I see him almost every day. I know his routine, his work. Javier took his phone out of his pocket. The blue light from the screen illuminated his face, creating deep shadows under his eyes. Alejandro is not an architect, he began, scrolling through his phone. At least, not exclusively. He is part of a network of professional scammers. They create false identities, establish relationships, gain people's trust, and then, he stopped, as if he found it difficult to continue. And then what? I pressed, although part of me didn't want to hear the answer. And then they take everything they can, he answered in a deep voice. Money, property, personal information. Anything they can use. My mind began to spin. I remembered all the times that Alejandro had shown interest in my finances, in those of my family. The seemingly innocent questions about my parents' house, about their retirement savings. Interest in helping me organize my bank accounts. Javier showed me his phone. On the screen were photos that made me feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. Alejandro, my Alejandro, with a beautiful wife and 2 small children. They were in what appeared to be a house in an elegant neighborhood in Guadalajara. Everyone was smiling at the camera, the perfect image of a happy family. This is Carolina, Javier said, pointing to the woman. His legal wife for 6 years. The children are Miguel and Laura, 5 and 3 years old. He went to the next photo. Alejandro at a party, kissing Carolina. The date in the corner of the image showed that it had been taken just 2 months ago, during one of his supposed business trips. There's more, Javier continued, showing me document after document. Marriage certificates, property deeds, bank accounts. All under different names, different identities. He's done this before. Multiple times. The pictures and documents became blurry as tears began to blur my vision. Each new revelation was like a knife digging deeper into my heart. Because I managed to ask between sobs. Why did you choose me? Javier put the phone away, once again submerging our surroundings in the silver light of the moon. You're a teacher, he said in a soft voice. You have a stable job, a united family, your own house that you inherited from your grandmother. But more importantly, you have connections in the educational community. Access to information about families, about children. He paused, letting the implications of his words sink into my consciousness. The horror of what he was suggesting hit me like an icy wave. No. I whispered. It just can't be. The network you work for isn't just dedicated to financial scams, Javier continued, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. They also traffic in information. Information that can be very valuable to the wrong people. I stood up abruptly, nausea threatening to make me vomit. I walked a few steps away from Javier, needing space, air, anything to help me process what I was hearing. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of sand and cacti under the moonlight. At that moment, I felt as lost as those lonely plants, trying to survive in a hostile environment. How did you discover it? I finally asked, without turning to look at him. I heard his footsteps approaching slowly over the sand. I work in construction, but not only that, he responded. I am a private investigator. I specialize in fraud and scam cases. A year ago, when he started talking about marrying you, something about his behavior seemed familiar. He stopped next to me, both of us looking towards the horizon where the mountains were silhouetted against the starry sky. I started investigating, he continued. At first I thought I was being paranoid, that my professional experiences were making me see ghosts where there were none. But the more I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. He took out a cigarette and lit it. The small flame from the lighter was like a shooting star in the darkness. I discovered their other identities. His other marriages. The fraudulent businesses, the scams, the destroyed lives he has left in his wake. The smoke from his cigarette rose toward the stars, forming ghostly patterns in the night air. "Does your mother know everything?" I asked. Javier nodded. "I told him a week ago. He didn't believe me at first, of course. Alejandro has always been his favorite, his perfect son. But when I showed him the evidence..." He exhaled a puff of smoke. "Well, you know my mother. He is not the most rational person when it comes to protecting family." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Does drugging and kidnapping me seem like a rational reaction to you?" "No," he answered firmly. "That's why I'm here." When he called me saying what he had done, I knew I had to intervene. The men he had hired, they are not good people. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought about what could have happened to me if Javier hadn't intervened. "And now what?" I asked, feeling the weight of the situation fall on my shoulders. "What am I supposed to do?" Javier put out his cigarette against a rock and put the butt in his pocket. "You have options," he said. "We can go to the police. I have enough evidence to press charges. But he's your brother," I completed the sentence for him. "Yes," he admitted. "And my mother would do anything to protect him, even if it means destroying more lives in the process." The silence of the desert enveloped us again. In the distance, the first lights of dawn were beginning to dye the horizon a soft pink color. "There is another option," Javier continued after a moment. "I can help you disappear. I have contacts, resources. We can make it look like you just walked away, that you changed your mind about the wedding. Alejandro wouldn't look for you, he cannot risk drawing attention to his activities." The proposal hung in the air between us, heavy with its implications. "Abandon everything?" I asked. "My job, my family, my life." "For a while," he answered. "Until we can make sure you're out of danger. Until we can build a solid case against him without my mother being able to interfere." The stars were beginning to fade in the increasingly clear sky. Soon it would be dawn, bringing a new day and decisions I never imagined having to make. "Why are you helping me?" I finally asked, looking directly at him. "You barely know me." Javier held my gaze, and for the first time I saw some vulnerability in his eyes. "Because 3 years ago, I met someone like you," he replied softly. "Someone who was the victim of a similar scam. I couldn't help her then. I did not arrive on time." The weight of his words, what he was not saying, felt like a slab on my chest. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Me too," he replied. "That's why I'm here now. That's why I can't stay with crossed arms while my brother destroys more lives." Javier's words hit me like a punch in my chest. I refused to believe it, although the tests were in front of my eyes. Alejandro was the man with whom he planned to spend the rest of my life, the man who had made me believe in true love after so many disappointments. Dawn began to paint the sky of pink and golden tones, transforming the desert landscape into something almost magical. The saguaros projected long shadows on the sand, and the fresh air of dawn brought the aroma to the ground and desert plants. It was the type of dawn that Alejandro and I used to admire during our weekend trips, when we escaped from the city to be alone. "It can't be true," I repeated, although my voice sounded weak even for my own ears. "There must be some mistake." Javier took his phone again and began navigating a folder full of files. "Look this," he said, showing me a series of documents. "These are the records of their different identities." On the screen there were images of official identifications, all with Alejandro's photo but with different names: Ricardo Mendoza, Carlos Fuentes, Antonio Vega. Each seemed perfectly legal, with official stamps and firms. As I started asking, but the words got stuck in my throat. They have contacts everywhere, Javier explained. Government offices, banks, even in some schools. It is a very sophisticated network. He continued to show me more documents. Property sale contracts, bank account states, marriage records. Each document was a new stab in my heart, one more proof of the secret life of the man who thought he knew. This is the purchase contract for your home in Guadalajara, said a deed. He signed it 5 years ago, before meeting you. And here. He designed her finger on the screen. There is the birth certificate of her eldest son, Miguel. The date on the document made me feel nausea. According to the roll, Miguel was born exactly 1 month after Alejandro and I began to leave. But I protested, his work trips, his calls, he always called me. Modern technology, Javier replied with a grimace. Applications that allow you to program calls and messages, false GPS to make it seem that you are in one place when you are actually in another. For someone with adequate resources, it is easy to maintain a double life. I remembered every time Alejandro had insisted that we use certain applications to communicate, how he always had a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. The pieces began to fit in a terrible way. And the architect's office? I asked, clinging to any detail that could deny this nightmare. I have visited it, I have met your co-workers. The office exists, Javier confirmed. But Alejandro doesn't really work there. It is a facade, a place that they rent and condition to maintain appearances. The partners you met are part of the same organization. I sat in a nearby rock, feeling that my legs couldn't sustain me anymore. The sun had already begun to heat the air, and the first drops of sweat ran by my back. There's more, Javier continued, showing me another series of documents. Account states that show suspicious transfers, properties sold at inflated prices, ghost companies. Each new revelation was like one more piece of a macabre puzzle. I remembered the time Alejandro had suggested investing my family's savings in a promising real estate project. At that time, I had seemed to care about our financial future. And Carolina? I asked, referring to his legal wife. Does she know anything about this? Javier shook his head. It's another victim. He believes that Alejandro is a successful businessman who constantly travels for work. It has its own version of the story, different from yours. The sun began to rise on the horizon, and the heat increased rapidly. I took off the sweater I was wearing, the same one that I had used last night when I went to Dona Leticia's house, which now seemed part of another life. There are more than you should see, Javier said, his voice becoming more serious. This is the most worrying. He opened another folder on his phone. This time, the images showed name lists, children's photographs, detailed personal information. What is this? I asked, although a part of me already knew the answer. Information collected from the schools where they have operated, he replied. Personal data of students, their families, financial situations, routines. The type of information that can be very valuable for wrong people. The horror of the situation hit me with all its strength. As a teacher, I knew exactly what kind of access I had to sensitive information about my students and their families. That's why he was interested in me, I whispered. For my work at school. Yes, Javier confirmed. Your position gives you access to valuable information. In addition, your reputation in the educational community makes people trust you naturally. I got up suddenly, walking in circles while trying to process everything. The sun was already completely on the horizon, and the heat of the desert began to become unbearable. All those questions about my students. I continued, remembering conversations that now had a completely different meaning. The times he offered to help me with school documentation. I was collecting information, Javier said. It is his modus operandi. Establish trust relationships to access valuable information. I stopped and looked at the horizon, where the air was already starting to ride the heat. The tears ran freely down my cheeks, but the sun dried them almost instantly. How many? I asked after a moment. How many people have scammed? Javier sighed heavily. We identified at least 12 cases in the last 8 years, he replied. But there are probably more that we have not discovered. He took a bottle of water from a small ice cream in the car and offered it to me. The water was warm, but my dry throat thanked her. And the police? I asked. Why have they not stopped it? It's complicated, Javier replied. The organization has connections everywhere. In addition, many victims do not report as shame, or because they have been threatened. He showed me more documents on his phone, archived police reports without investigating, complaints that never progressed, cases closed for lack of evidence. And when someone insists too much. His voice went out. Well, you already saw what my mother was willing to do with you. A chill ran off my back despite the heat. The image of Dona Leticia offering me drugged tea returned to my mind with terrible clarity. That's why you decided to become a researcher? I asked, connecting the points. To stop people like your brother. Javier nodded slowly. It's years old. When I started suspecting her activities, I tried to confront it, he said. He assured me that they were only normal businesses, that I was being paranoid. He even offered me to participate in his investments. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded me of Alejandro. But I kept investigating, he continued. And the more I discovered, the more I realized that my brother, the person with whom I grew up, whom I admired, no longer existed. If it ever really existed. The sun was already high in the sky, and the heat was almost unbearable. We moved in the shadow of Land Cruiser while Javier continued to show me more evidence, emails, text messages, surveillance photographs. How can someone live like this? I asked, more for myself than for him. How can you constantly lie, hurt so many people? The sociopaths are experts in seems normal, Javier replied. They are lovely, charismatic, they know exactly what to say and how to act to gain the confidence of others. His words made me think of every time Alejandro had loved my friends, my family. How I always knew what to say to make me feel special, loved, unique. Was it once real? I asked, my voice broken. Anything we lived together. Javier looked at me with compassion. I can't answer that, he said softly. But from my experience, people like him. They are not capable of true love. Everything is a performance, a tool to get what they want. The heat of the desert had become suffocating, but the cold I felt inside was more intense. For years of my life, plans, dreams, all based on lies. What will happen to Carolina and the children? I asked. With the other people you have cheated? I'm building a case, Javier replied. Collecting evidence, contacting other victims. But it has to be perfect. A single mistake and use your connections to bury everything. I looked at the empty road that extended to the horizon, where the air was already undulating the heat of the desert. The morning sun had transformed the landscape completely. What seemed like a mystical and mysterious place under the moon, now it was revealed in all its cruel reality. Arena, cactus, and stones as far as he had his eyes. Like my life, what last night seemed a fairy tale was now shown as a nightmare in Technicolor. Javier waited patiently while I processed everything. He had recharged against Land Cruiser, the shadow of the vehicle offering a small breath of relentless heat. His position reminded me of Alejandro that hurt, but now I could see the differences. Where Alejandro was all smiles and gestures studied, Javier showed a natural tension, an honest discomfort with the situation. You have two options, he finally said in a serious voice, breaking the silence that had settled between us. We can return and face my mother together, file a formal complaint, start a legal process. A significant pause was, or you can go and start over. Disappear before it's too late. The desert wind waved my hair, bringing with it the aroma to hot ground and dry vegetation. Somewhere nearby, a coyote released a solitary howl, as if I wanted to emphasize the loneliness of my situation. My eyes filled with tears while considering my options. The wedding was scheduled for 2 days. The dress that my mother had helped pay with her savings hung on my closet, waiting for the moment that would never come. The memories of the preparations hit me as an avalanche: the tests of the cake, the selection of flowers, the meetings with the coordinator of the event at the San Angel farm. If I decide to face them, I started, my voice just a whisper, what would happen exactly? Javier passed a hand on the face, a gesture that denoted fatigue and concern. It would be complicated, he replied honestly. I have enough evidence to present serious positions: fraud, impersonation of identity, theft of personal information, but the organization for which Alejandro works has powerful connections. He approached me, his steps raising small clouds of dust. And then my mother is, he continued. You already saw what is capable. If you decide to face them legally, it will not stop at anything to protect Alejandro and the honor of the family. The images of the previous night returned to my mind: Dona Leticia's tense smile, drugged tea, hours of horror in the car trunk. A chill ran off my back despite the scorching heat. And the other option? I asked, although I already knew the answer. Disappear. Javier nodded, taking out an envelope from his jacket pocket. I have contacts that can help you start a new life, he explained, opening the envelope. New documents, a clean bank account, even a job in another state if you wish. Within the envelope there was an identification with my photo but with a different name, credit cards, and a wad of tickets. So easy? I asked with a bitter laugh. Simply disappear as if the last 4 years had not existed. It will not be easy, Javier careened. You will have to leave everything behind: your work, your friends, your family, at least for a while, until it is sure to contact them again. My family. Thought hit me like a stomach punch. My mother would be devastated, my furious father, my sister Ana. I imagined the headlines in local newspapers: bride disappears 2 days before the wedding. Gossip, speculation, the pain of my loved ones. Is there another way? I asked, although I already knew the answer. Can't we simply expose Alejandro, show the tests to everyone? Javier shook his head. I already tried before, he said. With other victims. The organization has ways to make the tests disappear, that witnesses retract, that the investigations are archived. He approached the car and took out a bottle of water from the icebox, offering it. And the people who insist too much. He left the unfinished phrase, but the message was clear. I took a long drink of water, trying to clarify my thoughts. The sun was already high in the sky, and the heat was almost unbearable. Like my life at this time, suffocating, overwhelming, without a place to take refuge. What's there? I asked suddenly. What will happen to you when you realize that you helped me escape? A little smile appeared on his face, the first one that he saw since this nightmare began. Don't worry about me, he replied. I have been building this case for years. I have support of all the evidence in safe places, and contacts that can protect me. He moved away a few steps, looking towards the horizon where the air undulled by heat. In addition, he added, someone has to stay to make sure there are no more victims. I observed it with a new perspective. This man, who barely knew, who had always been a peripheral figure in my relationship with Alejandro, was risking everything to do the right thing. Because? I asked. Why do you risk like this? It is your brother, after all. Javier turned to look at me, and I saw in his eyes a mixture of determination and sadness. Precisely because it's my brother, he replied. We grew together, we shared the same values, the same education. But at some point, he chose this path. And I chose mine. He approached the car again and pulled out a backpack from the back seat. There are clean clothes, some food, a prepaid phone with safe contact numbers, he explained. If you decide to leave, the contact in Hermosillo will be waiting for you. He has everything prepared to help you start over. I looked at the backpack, then the envelope with the false documents, and finally the road that was lost on the horizon. The weight of the decision crushed me like the desert sun. On the one hand, there was the possibility of fighting, to face Alejandro and his organization, to expose their crimes and seek justice. But that would mean putting at risk not only my life, but that of my family. Dona Leticia had already shown that she would not stop at anything to protect her son. On the other hand, there was the option to flee, to disappear like so many other victims before me. Start a new life elsewhere, with another name, leaving behind everything I loved. My job as a teacher, my students, my friends, my family. The children, I said suddenly, remembering the information Alejandro had been collecting. The information of my students, already have it. Javier shook his head. Not even, he replied. So I could find out, they were barely beginning to collect data. Your disappearance probably frustrates those plans. A weight got out of my shoulders. At least I had not compromised the safety of my students. And Carolina? I asked. And your children? I'll make sure they are protected, Javier promised. I have already begun to document everything. When I have enough evidence, I will make sure they are safe before making my movement. I took a deep breath, feeling the hot air of the desert fill my lungs. The sun was directly on us now, causing the shadows to be collected under our feet. My mind returned to the last 4 years. Every moment I thought special, every promise, each plan for the future. Everything had been a carefully constructed lie. Alejandro, the man who thought I met, had never really existed. If I'm leaving, I started, can I contact my family eventually? When it is safe, Javier said. You will have to be extremely careful, but we will find a way. My eyes filled with tears again, but this time I let them run freely. The sun dried them almost instantly, as if the desert itself would like to erase my pain. I thought about my mother, how she would feel to discover that her daughter had disappeared. In my father, who would have to cancel the wedding, face the questions, pity looks. In Ana, that she would lose not only her sister but also the innocence of believing that people are fundamentally good. But I also thought of Alejandro's other victims. In Carolina and her children, living a life similar to mine. In families who had lost their savings, their homes, their confidence in others. In children whose information could have been sold to the highest bidder.